The day she watched my mother step out of that old Buick in front of the house on Alder Crest, Vivian Sloan never asked for a name. She looked at my mother's dark skin, tightened her mouth, and said it loud enough for the whole street to hear. "People like you rent, owners here know the rules." I stood by the gate and said nothing while she explained that the association had ways of handling folks who did not belong. What Vivian did not know was that my mother had not come to rent anything at all. And before the meeting that evening ended, Vivian herself would be the one to place the deed in my mother's hands. If you enjoy the kind of reversal that leaves an arrogant person completely silent, subscribe to the channel and stay with this story all the way to the end. My name is Darius Holloway. I am 46 years old, and I have spent more than 20 years advising people on how to hold, structure, and transfer property without losing their shirts. I own 3 suits, and I wear none of them unless somebody is being sued. That morning I had on a gray work jacket, jeans, and boots that had seen 2 winters of hauling boxes for my mother because we were 48 hours out from closing on a house and there was nothing left to do but look at it one more time. My mother, Lorraine Holloway, sat in the passenger seat of her 12-year-old Buick with her purse on her knees like she was going to church. She had refused to let me drive her. She said the car had gotten her through 31 years of hospital accounting and it could get her through one more Saturday. Briar Hollow looked exactly like the brochure that had come with the offering packet. Brick mailboxes, clipped hedges, a fountain at the entrance with a plaque nobody reads, and a clubhouse with white columns that were not holding up anything. Number 38 Alder Crest sat at the dead end of the last cul-de-sac, a 2-story brick house with black shutters and a magnolia tree in the backyard that leaned toward the kitchen window. It had belonged to a family that went under during a long, ugly stretch of missed payments, and after a foreclosure tied to a very large association lien, the house had ended up owned by the homeowners association itself. That is not a common thing. It is also not a comfortable thing because an association that owns a house has to pay for that house, and Briar Hollow had been paying for it for almost 2 years. My mother won it through a sealed bid submitted under the name of the LH Family Trust, with a law office standing between her name and every piece of paper that circulated among the board. That was not a scheme. That is simply how you buy a distressed asset when you do not want 14 strangers with opinions deciding whether they like your face. She had been outbid twice before on other properties by people who never had to explain themselves, and after the second time she stopped explaining herself too. So the board of Briar Hollow had voted to sell a house to a purchaser they had never met, and the president of that board had signed the resolution authorizing it, and none of them had the first idea who was going to be standing on the driveway that Saturday morning. We had been parked maybe 4 minutes when the golf cart came around the curve. It was white with a green stripe, and it made that low electric whine that always sounds like it is about to say something. The woman driving it wore a cream blazer, dark slacks, and a lanyard with a ring of keys hanging from it like a badge of office. She had a tablet balanced on the seat beside her, and she brought the cart to a stop at an angle that blocked half the driveway, which I noticed because people who do that on purpose usually do a lot of other things on purpose. My mother saw me notice and gave me the smallest shake of her head. That head shake has been ending arguments in my family since 1984. She did not say good morning. She did not say hello. She looked at the Buick first, then at my mother's flat shoes, then at my jacket, and she arranged her face into something that was almost a smile and not remotely friendly. "Are you looking for the rental office?" she asked. My mother answered the way she answers everything, which is plainly and without heat. "No, I'm here for number 38. The woman glanced at the house, then back at my mother, and something in her posture settled like she had solved a small puzzle and was pleased with herself for solving it quickly. "People like you rent around here," she said. "They don't usually buy." I turned my head then. I did not raise my voice or step forward. I just looked at her directly for the first time, and I let the silence sit there long enough for her to hear her own sentence played back. She did not flinch. That was the part that stayed with me. A person who says a thing like that and then immediately looks away is a person who knows they slipped. This woman held my eyes like she had said something practical about drainage. Then she turned the same look on me. "And you are?" I told her I was her son. She let out a short breath through her nose, the sound of a woman who has decided she is being generous with her time. "Then you should help your mother understand how neighborhoods like this work," she said. "There are standards here. There's an application process. There's a screening. There are documents. It saves everyone a great deal of embarrassment when that's handled correctly the first time." She introduced herself, finally, as Vivian Sloan, president of the Briar Hollow Community Association, and she said the title the way some people say their own last name at a country club. I said nothing back. Not one word of correction, and I want to be honest about why, because it was not patience and it was not some noble refusal to stoop. In the leather case sitting on the back seat of that Buick, 6 inches from my mother's grocery list, was a copy of the executed purchase agreement for 30 Aldercrest, and on the last page of that agreement, above a line that read "Authorized Signatory," was the signature of Vivian Sloan. She had already sold my mother that house. She just did not know it yet. And I decided, standing there in the sun with my mother's hand resting on the top of the car door, that I was going to let her keep talking. She kept talking. That is the thing about a person who mistakes silence for agreement. They treat it as an invitation. Vivian pulled out the tablet and started scrolling through what she called the highlights, and she delivered them to my mother in the tone you would use with a child who has already broken one thing in your house. Parking was the first item. No vehicle was to remain in a driveway for more than 72 hours without a visible association tag, and street parking overnight was prohibited from October through March, and she looked at the Buick again when she said it, twice, in case the point had somehow failed to land. Window treatments came next. She explained that all curtains and blinds visible from the street had to present a neutral face to the community, white or off-white or a light beige, no exceptions, no patterns, no colored liners. Trash containers had to be stored behind the fence line and could not appear at the curb before 6 in the evening on the night before collection, and any container left out past 10 in the morning generated a written notice on the first occurrence and a fine on the second. Guests were permitted, she said, but guests who visited more than 4 times in a calendar month were considered occupants, and occupants required registration. Move-in and move-out activity was restricted to weekdays between 9 and 4, which happened to make it impossible for anyone who worked a normal job to move into that neighborhood without taking a day off. My mother listened to all of it. She did not interrupt once, and here is the detail I have turned over in my head probably 400 times since. My mother never said she was renting. Not once. She said she was there for number 38, and every single thing Vivian built after that, she built on a foundation she poured herself. She heard an older black woman in a 15-year-old sedan say she had come about a house, and her mind filled in the rest before my mother had finished her sentence, and then she spent the next 20 minutes lecturing a woman about rules that woman was about to own. I walked up the driveway toward the front door because I wanted to look at the lockbox and check whether the hardware matched what the closing packet described. I got maybe 4 steps onto the walkway before Vivian's voice came sharp behind me. "Maintenance uses the side entrance." I stopped. I turned around slowly and I asked her, without any edge in my voice at all, whether she thought I was maintenance. She did not apologize. She did not even blink or backfill it with something softer the way most people do when they hear themselves out loud. She simply adjusted her grip on the tablet and moved forward. "Whatever you're here to do," she said, "I need it cleared through the association first. Contractors, movers, deliveries, all of it goes through the management portal. I don't know you, and I don't have a work order for this address." I asked her whether that rule applied to owners as well. She gave me a look I will remember for a long time, a look of genuine amusement, and she said, "Owners know enough not to ask." I have replayed that line more times than the other one. The first line was ugly and obvious. That one was the real philosophy underneath it. Owners in her mind were a category of person, and the category had a look, and neither of us fit it. My mother caught my eye across the driveway and shook her head again, one small motion. We had agreed on this in her kitchen 4 days earlier, over coffee and a legal pad. Nothing gets said until the closing is done, not because we were afraid, and not because we thought Vivian deserved some elaborate theatrical unveiling, but because of a very boring practical fact that anyone who has ever closed on a distressed property will understand immediately. The transaction was not finished. There was one signature outstanding on the deed itself, and the person authorized by board resolution to execute the conveyance on behalf of the association was standing in front of us, telling my mother where to put her trash cans. If I had opened my mouth on that driveway, I do not believe Vivian Sloan would have signed anything that week. I think she would have found a reason. She would have discovered a procedural defect, called an emergency executive session, demanded a title review, insisted that the trust produce a certification that would take 11 business days to obtain. I have watched people burn $100,000 of other people's money rather than sit in a room and be wrong in front of a witness. So I stood on a walkway I was 2 days from having a key to, and I let a woman tell me to use the side entrance, and I said, "Understood," and I walked back down to the car. My mother reached over and squeezed my forearm once, and neither of us said anything about it. To understand why that house mattered so much to Briar Hollow, you have to go back about 3 months to a board meeting my mother and I were not at and did not know about until much later, when the minutes became part of the closing file. 38 Alder Crest had come into the association's hands through a foreclosure on unpaid assessments, and the moment the association took title, that house stopped being a problem on paper and became a problem with a mailing address. The association was paying property taxes on it. The association was paying a vacant dwelling insurance premium, which is roughly double a normal premium and gets worse every renewal. The association was paying a landscaping contractor to cut a lawn nobody looked at, paying to run the heat just enough to keep the pipes from splitting in January, and paying a law firm to keep the title clean. Briar Hollow's reserve fund was thin. It had been thin before the house, and the house had been quietly eating it for 2 years. The roof on the clubhouse was in its final third of life, the pool liner was due, and the entrance fountain had been repaired twice with money that was supposed to go somewhere else. The treasurer's projection, which I read later in black and white, said that if 38 Alder Crest did not sell before the end of the quarter, the board would have to levy a special assessment on every household in the community to close the gap. Somewhere between $1,100 and $1,400 per home due in a single payment in a neighborhood where a lot of families were already stretched by the monthly dues. Special assessments end board careers. Vivian knew that better than anyone. So the board voted to sell. They listed it quietly through council rather than on the open market, partly for speed and partly because a house owned by a homeowners association tends to attract exactly the kind of questions a homeowners association does not want asked. My mother found out about it through Camille Prescott, a lawyer she had known since Camille was a young associate handling estate work for my late father. Camille called her on a Tuesday and said there was a brick house at the end of a cul-de-sac that might be worth a look, and my mother drove out there alone the next morning and parked across the street and did not get out of the car. She called me that afternoon, and she did not talk about square footage or comparable sales or the tax rate. She talked about the magnolia. There is a magnolia in the backyard of 38 Alder Crest, a big one, old enough that the lower branches have started to sweep the grass, and there had been a magnolia exactly like it behind the house on Chalmers Street where she raised me and my sister on a hospital accountant's salary after my father died. She said she stood at the fence line and looked at that tree and felt something come loose in her chest. She was 68 years old. She had just sold the last house she would ever sell, and she wanted a small quiet place with a tree she recognized. She bid fairly. That is the part I want to be very clear about, because people always assume there was some clever ambush built into this, and there was not. She did not lowball a distressed seller. She offered a number that was solidly within the appraised range. She offered it in cash from the proceeds of her prior sale. She asked for no repair credits, and she agreed to a closing timeline that solved the board's quarterly problem with 3 weeks to spare. Camille structured it through the LH Family Trust the way she structures everything for her clients over 60, because a trust avoids probate and keeps a widow's name out of a public database that gets scraped by every contractor and scam artist in the county. The board met, reviewed the offer, and voted to accept. 5 votes in favor, none against, 1 absent. The resolution authorized the president to execute all closing documents on behalf of the association. The purchaser was identified in the resolution exactly as it appeared in the offer, as the LH Family Trust, with the beneficiary disclosure held in the closing file at council's office, which is completely ordinary and completely legal and something that happens in this country several thousand times a day. Vivian Sloan signed that resolution. She never asked who was behind the trust. She had a cash buyer solving a $1,400 per household problem, and she had a signature line, and she signed it and went home. I have thought about the shape of that a great deal. Vivian Sloan had already agreed to sell my mother that house before she had ever once looked my mother in the eye. Every part of her judgment on that driveway had been rendered after the fact. She had taken my mother's money, in a legal sense, weeks before she decided my mother was the kind of person who rents. And when I finally understood that fully, standing in the sun listening to her explain curtain colors, I felt something that was not anger exactly. It was closer to the feeling you get watching somebody walk backward toward an open stairwell while lecturing you about safety. Around 4 that afternoon, a small delivery truck turned into the cul-de-sac. It was not a moving van. It was 2 boxes of kitchen things and a folding chair my mother wanted in the house so she would have somewhere to sit when she came to measure for blinds. The driver was a kid, maybe 22, and he had the ramp halfway down when the golf cart came around the corner again. I watched Vivian park it directly behind the truck this time. All was across, and I understood we had moved from lecturing into something else. She told the driver he needed to leave the community. He asked why. She told him there was no approved tenant at that address, no move-in authorization on file, and no registered occupant, and that any delivery to an unoccupied association owned required work order she had not issued. The kid looked at me, and I gave him a nod that meant, "It is fine. This is not your fight." I told Vivian there was not going to be a tenant application. She looked at me with the specific expression of a person who has decided that the problem is that you did not hear her the first time. "Then she isn't moving in," she said. I asked her on whose authority. She said, "Mine," and she said it the way a person says a word they have practiced. And that is where I understood who I was dealing with, because a president of a homeowners association does not have unilateral authority to bar a delivery, or to approve occupancy, or to decide who lives at an address the association happens to own. Those powers belong to a board, acting by vote, within the four corners of a set of governing documents, and Vivian Sloane had spent so many years being called president in a room with a coffee urn that she had come to believe the title was a source of power rather than a description of a chair. Then she walked over to my mother, who was standing by the mailbox with her purse still on her arm, and she lowered her voice into the register that people mistake for kindness. "I'm going to be candid with you," she said. "You might be more comfortable somewhere with fewer restrictions. There are lovely communities 20 minutes east, more relaxed, less paperwork. This place is very structured. I've seen people struggle here, and I'd rather spare you that." It is a remarkable sentence when you take it apart. Every word of it is technically about paperwork. Not one word of it is about paperwork. That was the whole texture of the day. There was no slur, no shouting, nothing that would look dramatic if you wrote it in a police report. There was tone, there were assumptions stacked one on top of another. There were two sets of standards operating in the same driveway, one for the people Vivian had decided belonged, and one for us. A white couple in a leased sedan would have been handed a welcome folder and offered the code to the pool gate. We got a warning about how many times a guest could visit before becoming an occupant. My mother let a few seconds go by. Then she asked, in the calmest voice you have ever heard, "What exactly do you mean by people like me?" And Vivian stopped. That was the first crack, and it was a small one, but it was real. Her mouth opened and nothing came out for a beat and a half, because she had run headlong into the wall that people like her always run into, which is that they will absolutely think it, and they will absolutely act on it, and they will absolutely say it out loud to a woman standing beside a Buick, but they will not define it when a witness is standing 4 feet away. "People unfamiliar with communities of this standard," she said finally. I wrote it down that night, word for word, in the notes application on my phone, along with the time and the 2 other sentences from that morning. Not because I was building a case. I was not planning to sue anybody, and my mother would have hated it if I had. I wrote it down because I have learned that people who say things like that will look you in the face 2 weeks later and tell you that you misremembered. And misremembering is a lot harder when you have the sentence with a timestamp on it. The truck left, the boxes went back to my trunk. My mother got into her car and folded her hands in her lap and said, "Well, that was the entire commentary, not one complaint the whole drive home." She asked me twice whether I thought the magnolia would need trimming before winter. Closing was set for 6:30 the following evening at the Briar Hollow Clubhouse, which was unusual only in location. The board wanted it done on their own ground, in front of a quorum, because that is how they had structured every decision about that house. Camille Prescott arrived at 5 with 2 banker's boxes and the calm of a woman who has done 4,000 of these. I know Camille well enough to know what her calm looks like from the outside and what is running underneath it, and I want to say plainly that she did not orchestrate what happened next. She did not have to. She simply declined to volunteer information to a woman who had not asked for it. Vivian found her setting up in the meeting room and started complaining before she had put her bag down. She said there was a situation at 38, that a woman had been on the property twice, that a delivery had been attempted without authorization, and that she had been forced to intervene personally. Camille kept unpacking files and asked, without looking up, "What's her name?" And Vivian did not know. She had spent the better part of a day telling my mother where she could park, what color her curtains could be, and which communities 20 minutes east might suit her better, and she had never once asked the woman's name. She actually had to reach for it. "Lorraine," she said. "Lorraine something." Camille's pen stopped moving on the page. She set it down flat, which is a thing she does, and she raised her head. "Lorraine Holloway?" Vivian said yes, and then with real interest, "You know her?" Camille looked at her for what must have been 3 full seconds and said, "You could say that," and then she went back to her boxes. Now, a different kind of person would have felt the floor shift right there. Vivian did not. She followed Camille around the table and kept going, because in her mind she was reporting a maintenance issue to a professional who would obviously agree with her. She said the woman's son had been on the property as well, that he had questioned her authority twice, that he had been evasive about his purpose, and that in her experience that kind of thing escalates if you do not address it immediately. Camille asked in exactly the same flat tone as before, Darius Holloway? That one landed. I know it landed, because Grant Ellison told me afterward that he walked into the room at that exact moment and saw Vivian standing very still with her tablet against her chest. Grant was the vice president, a man of about 60 who had spent his career in commercial insurance, and who cared about precisely one thing, which was whether the association's balance sheet survived the quarter. He was not a warm man, and I would not call him an ally. He was something more useful. He was a man who could read a note. My mother and I came in at 6:20. She wore a navy dress and her good coat, and she had done her hair, and she was carrying nothing but her purse, because everything that mattered was already in Camille's boxes. 6 people were seated at the long table. Vivian was standing at the head of it with the keys still on her lanyard. The moment she saw us, she raised her hand like a crossing guard and said, "I'm sorry, this is a private board closing. It's not open to the community." Camille did not look up from the file she was squaring against the table. "They're supposed to be here," she said. Vivian said something about executive session and confidentiality of financial matters, and Camille said, still very pleasantly, "Vivian, sit down. We're 8 minutes from starting." And I watched the president of the Briar Hollow Community Association look around a room where nobody was going to back her up and pull out a chair and sit down at her own table like a guest. Camille opened the folder. She read the file number, the property address, the parcel identification, and the nature of the instrument, all in that flat professional cadence that makes a legal proceeding sound like a weather report. Then, she read the grantor, the Briar Hollow Community Association, acting by board resolution dated the previous quarter. Then she said grantee and purchaser of record, the LH Family Trust. Vivian nodded. That name she recognized. She had signed a resolution with that name on it. Then Camille said, beneficiary and trustee of record, Lorraine Holloway. And she did not pause for effect. She did not glance up. She just kept going into the recitation of the funds and the escrow confirmation, which somehow made it worse. Nobody gasped. Nobody stood up. There was no music. There was only the sound of a woman, 2 chairs down, clicking a pen and then stopping halfway through the click, and the very particular quality of silence that arrives in a room when 6 people all understand something at once and are waiting to see who acknowledges it first. Vivian turned her head toward my mother slowly, the way you turn toward a sound you hope you imagined. My mother was sitting with her hands folded on the table in front of her, perfectly still, looking back at her without any expression I could name as triumph. "You're the buyer," Vivian said. It came out as a statement because her voice would not go up at the end. My mother said, "That's what I've been trying to tell you," which was not quite true, and both of them knew it, and that was the closest my mother came all evening to anything sharp. "There must have been some confusion," Vivian said, "and I want you to understand how fast that came out. Less than 2 seconds. The confusion defense was fully assembled and waiting in her mouth before the pause had finished. I said, "No, you were very clear." She looked at me then, really looked. The way you look at a piece of furniture you have walked past 100 times and suddenly notice is not yours. "And you're her representative," she said. I opened my case and set 3 things on the table in front of me: the durable power of attorney executed and notarized in March, the trust certification, and the closing packet tabbed with my handwriting in the margins on 11 pages, including the page where the association's own counsel had asked for a modification to the title covenant, and I had drafted the response. Grant Ellison leaned forward slightly to look at it. I said, "I'm her son. Today that's enough." The man Vivian had told to use the side entrance was the man who had structured the transaction that was about to save her association $1,400 a household. I did not say that. I did not have to. Camille had already slid the settlement statement across the table, and Grant was reading it, and I could see the exact second his eyes reached the wire confirmation line. Vivian did not fold. I will give her that much. A weaker version of this story is one where the villain crumbles the moment she is caught, and that is not what happened. Because that is not what these people do. What she did was reach for procedure, which is the only weapon she had ever needed. She said she was not prepared to proceed this evening. She said the purchaser had not gone through resident screening. She said the association had an occupancy review process that applied to all new residents and that skipping it would set a precedent. She said the board should reconvene and review the matter with fresh eyes. Camille answered each one without raising her voice, and she answered them in the order Vivian raised them, which had the effect of making it sound like a checklist being closed. There was no resident screening requirement in the governing documents applicable to a purchaser. There was a tenant registration process which applied to tenants, which my mother was not. There was an occupancy review that applied to short-term rental applications, adopted 3 years earlier, and it did not touch a fee-simple conveyance, and the board had already voted. The resolution was in the file. Vivian's signature was on it. "Then I'd like the board to revisit the resolution," Vivian said. And that was the moment Grant Ellison finally spoke, and he did not speak to her. He spoke to the room. He said the association had accepted earnest money 41 days earlier. He said the funds for the full purchase price had been received and confirmed by council that afternoon. He said the treasurer's projection had been built around this closing and had already been presented to the community in the quarterly notice. And he said, looking down the table at Vivian, "If we walk away tonight, we're in breach. We return her money, we pay her legal fees, we keep paying taxes and insurance on an empty house, and I am going to have to stand up at the annual meeting and explain to 206 households why they owe $1,400 apiece." Vivian said, "I have a duty to protect property values," and I asked her quietly, "From my mother?" Nobody said anything. I counted it out afterward, and I believe it was close to 6 seconds, which does not sound like much until you are in a room where 6 people are looking at the floor. Vivian's mouth moved once without producing sound. Then she said she had never suggested any such thing, that her concerns were entirely procedural, that she had simply been doing what any diligent president would do when an unregistered individual appeared at an association-owned property, and that it was extremely unfair to characterize her diligence as anything else. I said, "People like you rent." I said it exactly the way she had said it, at the same volume, with the same small pause before the last word. Then I said, "Owners know the rules." That was earning on the driveway at 38 Alder Crest. There was also maintenance uses the side entrance, and people unfamiliar with communities of this standard, and you might be more comfortable somewhere with fewer restrictions. I wrote all 4 of them down within the hour. I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm telling you what you said, because you're about to tell this table that you didn't. Grant Ellison looked at Vivian for a long moment. He did not look outraged. That would be too generous a description of the man. He looked like an insurance underwriter calculating an exposure, which is exactly what he was. 2 of the other board members had gone very carefully, still in the way people do when they realize they are witnesses to something rather than participants in it. The treasurer, a woman named Ruth, had put her pen down and folded her hands in her lap and was staring at the middle of the table. Camille closed her folder with one hand unhurried. "Vivian," she said, "I'm counsel for this transaction, not for you personally. So understand this as information rather than advice. I strongly recommend you stop talking about who you believe belongs here." And that was all she said. She did not name a statute. She did not use the phrase that everyone at that table was already thinking. She let the outline of it sit in the room, which was far more effective, because a threat you construct yourself is always more frightening than one somebody hands you. The balance in that room shifted completely, and it shifted without anybody raising a voice. 10 minutes earlier, Vivian Sloan had been standing at the head of the table telling 2 people they were not allowed in the building. Now she was sitting in the middle of it, and the vice president was checking a wire confirmation, and the attorney had just advised her to be quiet, and every other person there was mentally reviewing whether they had ever nodded along while she said something similar. Grant said, "Let's finish this." Camille went through the packet in order, the way she does. Settlement statement signed. Association certificate confirming that all assessments on the property were current as of the date of transfer signed. Corporate resolution attached as an exhibit, already executed, dated, and then she took the last document out of the folder, turned it to face the head of the table, and slid it down in front of Vivian, and I watched my mother's hands, folded on the table, not move at all. It was a special warranty deed. 1 page of substance and a page of acknowledgement, and it does not look like anything. That is something people never expect. The single most consequential piece of paper in most American lives is a page and a half of dense type, with a legal description of a parcel that reads like a siddle. And it is over in about 90 seconds. The grantor line read Briar Hollow Community Association, a nonprofit corporation. The grantee line read Lorraine Holloway, trustee of the LH Family Trust. And at the bottom, above a blank line, it read Authorized Signatory Vivian Sloan, President. She looked at it for a long time. I have wondered since what she was actually reading, because certainly was not the legal description. I think she was reading her own name printed underneath my mother's, and understanding, in a way that no argument from me could ever have produced, that the mechanism by which Lorraine Holloway was going to become an owner in Briar Hollow was her own hand, not a court, not a board she could blame, not a rule somebody else wrote. Her signature in her handwriting on the line beneath her title, the title she had used all day as a reason why my mother did not belong. "You expect me to sign this," she said, and she said it to Grant, not to Camille and not to us. Grant did not even look up from the settlement statement. "The board already voted," he said. Camille added, without any particular emphasis, "and the association already accepted her funds." That was the whole of it. There was no speech, no reckoning, no moment where anyone explained to Vivian Sloan what kind of woman she had been that weekend. There was simply a document, a fiduciary duty, 206 households, and a pen. She signed it. Her hand was steady, which I noticed and respected in a strange way. The notary, a young man from Camille's office, who had been sitting silently in the corner for an hour with no idea what he had walked into, took the page, checked her identification against the signature, applied the seal, and logged it in his journal. Camille confirmed on a short phone call that the funds had been released to the association's account, ended the call, and said, "We're closed." And then came the part I truly did not plan and could not have arranged if I had tried, because it was not drama, it was just procedure. The custom in Camille's practice is that the grantor delivers the executed original to the grantee at the table. It is a formality that dates back to when delivery was a legal requirement rather than a courtesy, and Camille observes it because she is precise about everything. So she assembled the packet, squared the edges, held it out to Vivian, and said, "Would you deliver this to the grantee, please?" Vivian Sloane stood up. She walked the length of that table with the deed in both hands, past Grant, past Ruth, past the empty chair at the corner, and she stopped in front of my mother, who had not moved and had not spoken in 20 minutes. And she held it out. My mother took it with both hands the way she takes everything, and set it on the table in front of her and looked at it for a few seconds. The room was so quiet I could hear the ice machine behind the clubhouse kitchen door. Then my mother looked up at her and said, "You were right about one thing." Vivian's forehead creased. "What's that?" And my mother said, "Owners should know the rules." That was it. She did not smile when she said it, and she did not say it cruelly, and she did not follow it with anything. Then she put the deed in her purse, and she thanked Camille by name, and she asked Grant where the community mailboxes were, because she wanted to know where to pick up her mail. Grant told her. He also told her the pool gate code and that trash pickup was Thursday, and that the man who did most of the lawns in the cul-de-sac was reliable and charged $40. It was the first ordinary human exchange anyone in that building had offered my mother since she arrived in Briar Hollow, and it happened 4 feet from a woman who had spent a day explaining to her that she would be more comfortable elsewhere. My mother moved into 38 Alder Crest 11 days later on a Tuesday between 9 and 4, because the move-in window was in the governing documents, and she is the kind of woman who follows a rule even when the rule was written by somebody who wanted her gone. The Buick went into the driveway and then, once the garage was cleared, into the garage, and it is still there, washed with 190,000 miles on it and a hospital parking sticker in the corner of the windshield that she has never scraped off. I know what a story like this is supposed to do at the end. It is supposed to reveal that the quiet woman in the old sedan was secretly enormously wealthy, that there was a second house nobody knew about, that the son in the work jacket pulled up the next week in something absurd just to be seen. None of that happened, and I would not tell it that way even if it had, because that version accidentally agrees with Vivian. That version says my mother deserved the house because it turned out she had more than anyone assumed. She did not need to be more than she was. She was a retired hospital accountant with a paid-off car, 31 years of careful saving, and a legitimate winning bid, and that was already on its own completely sufficient. The board took action about a month afterward, and it was less than justice and more than nothing. Grant brought a proposed policy at the next regular meeting, and it passed 4-1 with 1 abstention, and Vivian was the abstention. Under the new procedure, no individual officer may question, screen, or restrict access to a person visiting a property in the community. All matters relating to sale, purchase, or occupancy of association-owned property route through the management company and legal counsel. And no standard relating to community image, appearance, or fit may be applied to any resident or prospective resident, unless that standard appears in writing in the governing documents. That last clause was Ruth's addition, and I thought it was the sharpest thing anyone did in that whole affair, because it quietly deleted the entire vocabulary Vivian had been operating in. Standards, fit, this kind of community. Communities of this standard, all of it, gone, unless you can point to the page. There was no lawsuit. My mother would not have one, and I asked her twice. She said she had gotten the house and the tree and the quiet street, and that a lawsuit would mean spending the next 2 years of her life inside the worst day of it. I have handled enough litigation to know she was right, and I have also lain awake more than once wondering whether letting it go was generous or simply easier, and I have not fully settled that question with myself. What I have settled is that it was hers to decide and not mine. Vivian Sloane still lives in Briar Hollow. She finished her term as president and did not stand for another, and Grant Ellison holds the gavel now and runs meetings that end in 35 minutes. She still walks a small gray dog in the evenings, and she still keeps her lawn immaculate, and when my mother's street comes up in conversation, she becomes suddenly very interested in something on her phone. She has never apologized. I stopped expecting it somewhere around the 2nd month. and I recommend that to anyone in a similar position, because waiting for an apology from a person like that is a way of letting them keep an appointment on your calendar forever. She was there at the first community meeting my mother attended, standing near the coffee urn with a paper cup. A woman named Deb, who lives 2 doors down and who has since become the person my mother trades tomatoes with, came over and asked, in the friendliest way, whether Lorraine was the new tenant in the brick house at the end. It was an innocent question, there was nothing in it, but it hung there, and I saw Vivian go still by the urn, close enough to hear, and I turned my head and looked at her, and she did not say one word. My mother smiled at Deb and said, "No, I own it," and then she asked Deb about the tomatoes, and that was the end of it, and the two of them talked for 20 minutes about blight and cages while I stood by the wall and drank bad coffee. I used to think the best moment of the whole thing would be watching Vivian Sloane pick up that pen. I was wrong about that, and it took me a few weeks to understand why. That moment was satisfying, but it was satisfaction that belonged to her in a way. It was defined entirely by her face and her humiliation and what she had to do. It was still a room organized around Vivian. The real moment came on a Saturday morning in October. I drove out with a ladder to fix a gutter, and I came around the back of the house, and my mother was sitting in a folding chair under that magnolia with coffee and the crossword in the sun on grass she owned at an address that was hers. The deed was in a fireproof box in the hall closet, recorded at the county 3 days after closing, indexed under her name where anybody with an internet connection can look it up. And there was not one person in that entire neighborhood on that morning or any morning after it with the standing to walk up to my mother and ask her whether she belonged there.